All right, should we kick off?
Yep, sounds good. Steve, are you there? Perfect. All right, I'm going to start the webinar.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Transport Planning Society event tonight, which forms part of our Transport Planning Day campaign for 2022. My name is Mark Frost. I'm director of a small transport planning consultancy called Fern Consulting, and I have the joy, the honour of being current chair of the Transport Planning Society, and I'll be facilitating this evening's session. I should say a little bit about TPS to start. TPS aspires to be the natural home of transport planning and transport planners. We were founded back in '97, which those who are good at maths here will realise is 25 years ago this year, as a society to facilitate, develop and promote best practice, innovation in transport planning and provide a focus for dialogue between all those engaged in it, whatever their background. So it's therefore great that we have a really good mix of practitioners, thought leaders, esteemed academic professionals on tonight's panel to discuss this most difficult of topics, which is how we develop our transport network in the future to meet the challenge of decarbonisation. And I should say also that we have all of you in the room as well, and all the diverse backgrounds that you bring to this discussion. And we're very much hoping that you'll engage with tonight's event and you'll post questions and information in the chat. And I see we've already got one person from Chiswick in the chat. It's always someone from Chiswick who puts the comment in first. Welcome, Ruth. So the subject of this evening talk forms one of the central parts of our Transport Planning Day campaign for this year, which is about how we future-proof the transport network to meet the needs of tomorrow. So learning from COVID, rising to the challenge of net zero, we want to explore how we update our tools and techniques to ensuring we are designing the right kit for the next generation. So being a good ancestor, as it's sometimes called. We're going to look at a whole range of different debates. In fact, we've already started. We had an excellent session on modelling last week, which was chaired by none other than Dr. Tom van Vuren, discussing how modelling can respond to this challenge. We're touching on appraisal, scenario planning, developing persuasive narratives for progressive schemes as part of strategic outline business cases, micro-mobility, intergenerational equity, and even a bit of storytelling. So we're trying to cover a whole raft of different areas there around this theme. The culmination of Transport Planning Day this year will be an in-person event at the ICE's offices in London and Great George Street on the afternoon of the 14th of November, including a drinks reception. We're hoping to have a minister in attendance. We've got some warm leads on that. We'll be having a presentation from Stephen Joseph from the University of Hertfordshire, who have been doing some work updating the Society's State of the Nations report, exploring the practice and craft of transport planning across the constituent parts of the UK and how that is rapidly diverging and what that might mean for practitioners. And we also have a session exploring specifically the idea of intergenerational equity, and that will be informed by the Future Generations Office at the Welsh Assembly Government. And we'll try and drop a link in the chat as well for people who might be interested in that. There's various other webinars coming up, as I've suggested, already detailed, particularly one about micro-mobility and where that might fit as part of this puzzle, and also some stuff around scenario planning from last year's successful TPS bursarians who explored this subject as part of their bursary. I want to thank all the people that have sponsored Transport Planning Day this year, and in particular Stantec, Charge Surveys, Mayor Brown, Teralytics, Advanced Transport Systems, Arup, VLC, Kestrel Surveys, and particularly Jacobs as our gold sponsor and Steer as our platinum sponsor, who've just been announced. So thank you for that. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to do this sort of stuff. I also thank all the members on the call, because obviously we really wouldn't be able to do it if it wasn't for you, and it wouldn't really be a lot of point either. So thank you for staying with the society. So now on to today's event. So I'm really actually overjoyed and a little bit awed and a little nervous really to present somebody who I consider to be a transport planning legend, David Metz, who has got a long and august history in the transport planning sphere. David is an honorary professor at the Centre for Transport Studies, having previously been chief scientist at the Department for Transport. But he also has an early career in as a scientific staff in the Medical Research Council and a long career in civil service off the back of that. He's an author of, I think, at least 3 books exploring the issue of travel demand and the impact that might have on practitioners. Though I did also find a book by David Metz exploring 4 months in Alaska and the impact that had on his mental well-being. So I don't know whether, David, you can claim ownership of that.
No.
Okay, that's a shame. Maybe that we'll ask the other David Metz to the next session. So the way that we're going to do this is David is going to give a short lecture, about sort of half an hour, picking out some of the key themes from his new book, which incidentally is excellent. It is here, and you can see by the number of bits that there's a lot of information in there that's relevant for practitioners. And it is also, very kindly, David has made available to TPS members at a massive 30% discount. So please, if you are a TPS member, a value of that, we'll put the link for that in the chat. We'll then go to our panel members, who I'll introduce as I invite them to speak, just for their initial reflections on David and their own ideas in this space. And then we've got, I think we should probably have nigh on about an hour for a panel discussion on this. But I hope that we'll get lots of questions in the Q&A section or indeed in the chat. I'll try and monitor both. If you could use the chat, that might be helpful, because I find my eyes get drawn mostly towards that. I'd like to thank, first of all of the panel, and particularly Dave for giving his time to the Society for this evening's event. So thank you very much. And without further ado, David, I think I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your kind introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen. Just try and get the full screen.
Yeah, we can see the slides, but yes, that's it. You're perfect. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the topic of my latest book, Decarbonising Travel After the Pandemic. That aspect is really the second half of the book. The first half is an account of where we are with travel and transport, where we've come from, what the problems are, how we've tried to deal with them. And then I go on to discuss the impact of the pandemic and what that means for the future. Now, I'm not going to try and summarize the whole book. What I'm going to do instead is to talk about 2 specific topics which are interesting in themselves, relevant to decarbonisation, and which illustrate the kind of analysis that I think we need to engage in to make progress. So let me see. I'm quite sure how to move this slide on. Here we are. Okay. So let's start here with a screenshot from Google Maps. I'm sure this kind of thing is familiar to everyone. This is for a journey between Luton and Bedford during the morning peak. And as usual, you see 3 routes shown. The most direct route is due north up the A6. Just over 20 miles, taking 48 minutes. But there's another route using the M1 motorway, which runs close to Luton, but veers away, so you have to cut back across on the A421 to reach Bedford. So that's a longer route, that's 8 miles longer, but at this time of the morning, it's 5 minutes faster. Now that isn't particularly surprising, but it's a particularly interesting section of the motorway because between this section between junctions 10 and 13 was one of the first implementations of the smart motorway concept, whereby the hard shoulder was converted to a running lane, and in this case, during the morning and evening peak, with the aim of increasing capacity and smoothing flows. The 5-year post-opening evaluation was carried out and published, and it was found that the traffic moved more slowly 5 years after opening than it had done before the scheme was implemented, which was unexpected and disappointing, of course. And when the benefit cost ratio was recalculated, it was found to be negative. So something had gone wrong with the modelling that had been used to justify the investment. So I sought and obtained copies of the reports of the modelling. There was a traffic modelling exercise that used a regional variable demand model based on the Saturn suite of models, long established, widely used in the UK. And the outputs from that, comparing the do something and do minimum cases, were inputs to the economic model, which is the Department of Transport's TUBA model, which generated monetary values for the benefits. So for business traveller, there were substantial time-saving benefits offset by a modest increase in vehicle operating costs on account of a greater volume of traffic. For non-business users, commuters and others, there were also substantial time-saving benefits, but these were entirely offset by increased vehicle operating costs. And you can see from the screenshot why that would be reasonable. If people are diverting to the motorway to use a faster route, they're less conscious of the increased fuel costs, but that is entirely relevant to the economic case. And you can also see that local users have options if they're making regular journeys, say from home to work, from Luton to Bedford. You've got a number of routes, those shown here and others. And in the past, I guess people would have made choices based on the immediate experience. But now, with the advent of digital navigation, which is the term I'm using in place of the more familiar sat-nav, because I think we're going to talk about it, we need a slightly more formal term. What digital navigation does is to make clear what the options are. And in this case, it serves to increase local use of the increased capacity on the motorway, thereby undermining the economic case, which is based on the value of the increased capacity to business users. Now, this is one example. Another example that I've looked at is the M25 junctions 23 to 27 smart motorway implementation. That's the one outlined in the book. And again, the story, a similar one. No time savings were found beyond the first year after opening on account of the greater volume of traffic. And again, the story was that there are advantages for local users in diverting to the motorway to take advantage of the faster trip, sometimes called junction hopping, and that undermined the benefit of the investment for the business users, goods vehicles, cars on business trips, which underpin the economic case for the investment. Now, I think we may be in a general situation here because the motorway system, the strategic road network, is under greatest stress in or near areas of population density where you've got both local and long distance users. Remote from areas of population density, mostly the traffic flows fairly freely. If our motorway system was a toll road system, as is the case in France and Italy, then the existence of tolls would deter local users. The one example we have of that in the UK is the M6 toll road in the West Midlands, where the daily traffic is about half that of the nearby untolled M6. But that's the exception that proves the rule. And I think we have to anticipate that when we invest in the motorway and major road networks to increase capacity, a lot of the benefit is taken up by local users, thereby undermining the economic case. Now, we need, I think, now to do two things. One is to incorporate the behavioral change induced by the digital navigation into our modeling. To my knowledge, this isn't done thus far. We can also use digital navigation to understand better what's happening when we do evaluation. When we model, we distinguish between business users and others. We divide business users into cars, light goods and heavy goods vehicles, and non-business users into commuters and others. And all these have different values of time saving. But when we evaluate the outcome of a scheme, all that has been done so far has been to measure total volume of traffic without being able to distinguish the different classes. So you may have an outcome where the measured outcome is quite close, total traffic is quite close to the forecast, but the composition of that traffic may be quite wrong. And now it is possible, using origin and destination data generated by the providers of digital navigation, to distinguish between the traffic that stays on, in this case, the full section of the motorway from before junction 10, south of Luton, to beyond junction 13, distinguish that traffic, the long distance traffic, from traffic that joins and leaves within a segment. And that is important for the overall economic benefits. Now, there's a maxim that you can't build your way out of congestion, and we know from experience that's generally true. And the two examples I've mentioned exemplify that truth. But when we ask road users in surveys, focus groups, and the rest, why congestion is a problem, what they tell us is that what bothers them most is the uncertainty about journey time. That's more important than the fact the trip is slower than it might otherwise be. And of course, the answer to uncertainty about journey time is shown in this screenshot, in that we have predictive journey time information. So I think that digital navigation is providing us with the best means we have to mitigate the impact of road traffic congestion. And it's already with us, we don't have to do anything, and therefore it's far, far more cost effective than trying to tackle congestion through investment in new capacity. So let me sorry, I'm apologizing. I apologize. I'm having difficulty in shifting my slides. Can anyone advise me?
Presumably it's not working with just the arrow keys, David?
No, I'm trying different arrow keys. I obviously moved it initially.
If you click it on the mouse, presumably, or?
Let's try. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thinking now about future road investments, and we're in the middle of the program, the 5-year program worth 27 billion, known as Road Investment Strategy 2, and people are beginning to think about Road Investment Strategy 3, RIS 3, which would be intended to run from 2026 to 2030. There are headwinds in my view. So I think the economic benefits are overstated, as I've described. There's clearly an inconsistency with the net zero carbon objective, in that the more additional capacity you build, the more vehicle use will be with tailpipe emissions, and the more embedded carbon. There are the public anxieties about the safety of smart motorways, crashes on the hard shoulder, coroner's inquests, the House of Commons Transport Committee reporting critically, and the previous Secretary of State calling a halt to new smart motorway schemes until there's 5 years worth of data on safety. And it'll be interesting to see if such schemes resume. And then there was the Levelling Up white paper published earlier this year, which had a dozen objectives across government departments. And the one transport objective was to improve public transport in the regions towards what has been achieved in London. But there was no requirement for any road investment to support levelling up. And that is sensible because, in fact, the strategic road network is more subject to delays in the southeast of England than in the Midlands and the north. Now, what the status of that levelling up white paper is with the new Prime Minister is not yet clear. But there's an underlying strategic question, which is whether we should shift our focus from building new capacity to operational efficiency of the capacity that we've got. Now, it's interesting, I think, to compare the aviation sector, where there are plans for major civil engineering investment, for example, a third runway at Heathrow. But the day-to-day business of aviation is all about operational efficiency, airlines maximizing use of their aircraft, of their landing slots, passengers on seats, the airports getting throughput of passengers and baggage, difficulties recently, but the objective there is clear. And the air traffic management people maximizing use of crowded airspace. So the whole focus here is operations, and the underlying discipline is not civil engineering, it's operations research. And the supporting economic analysis is not the analysis of long-lived investments, it's the analysis of operations. Now, I think there's a good argument for saying that we should treat our strategic road network and our road network generally as a mature system, out of which we need to get the best optimized use, which is, after all, what we do with urban roads. We don't aim to add capacity to urban roads on account of road traffic congestion. We aim to operate those roads to maximize efficiency. And in this context, a curious and interesting phenomenon is the disregard of digital navigation, of sat-nav, by the authorities, by National Highways Department for Transport, as far as I know, of local roads authorities, with the exception of Transport for London, which has a relationship with Waze. I find this very curious, given the very widespread use of digital navigation. And I suspect it's a matter of the people concerned having the wrong professional disciplines, civil engineers, not operational researchers, for example. And they can get away with this, I might say, because the organizations they're working in are monopolies, so there's no competitive pressure here. But the exception to that rule is the road freight sector, which is very competitive and which has exploited digital technologies very fully, both to operate fleets on the strategic road network and local deliveries. And we know this from our day-to-day experience when we order stuff online, and we are told when it will be delivered, often a 2-hour or even a 1-hour time slot. We can track our packages. We're asked for feedback, all done through algorithm. And in my view, there's a good case for bringing that operational efficiency approach to bear on the road network as a whole. And then it would be natural, I'm sure, to take advantage of digital navigation, which after all is a very extensive vehicle to infrastructure connectivity, changing travel behavior. It would be natural to take advantage of that through collaboration between the road authorities and the providers of digital navigation, both to deal with stresses on the network, incidents, bad weather, queues at Dover and the rest, but also to optimize use of the network more generally, in particular keeping traffic out of unsuitable roads for through traffic. So that is my first topic that I wanted to talk about. And my second topic is about cycling, which starts with a visit I made a few years ago to Copenhagen, a study visit with a group of urbanists. And we spent a really interesting weekend cycling around the city, experiencing the excellent cycling infrastructure and being briefed on the cycling culture. And they're very keen to tell people about their achievement, and they publish from time to time a document as shown here. But when you're in Copenhagen, you realize there's quite a lot of general traffic. And if you ever watch the various television dramas set in Copenhagen, whether the political ones or the crime ones, you do see the odd character on a bicycle, but most people rush around in cars like anywhere else. But the data provided in the bicycle account document can be used with Transport for London's data to compare trip mode share between Copenhagen and London. So cycling in Copenhagen, 28%, 10 times that in London, as expected. But car users, you see, it's only 2% in Copenhagen, it's only slightly less than in London. And the other big difference in Copenhagen and London is that public transport use in Copenhagen is about half that in London. That's something that's not generally appreciated. Now that's saying that you can get people off the buses onto bikes, because bikes are cheaper, healthier, environmentally better, and no slower in congested traffic. But harder to get them out of their cars, even in a small flat city like Copenhagen with a very strong cycling culture and excellent cycling infrastructure. I think it's very likely that all those car users in Copenhagen have got bikes at home and use them for other trips, or at least have had bikes and have used them. So there are, even in this situation, quite powerful attractions in car ownership and use. Now, if we look at data for other European cities, it's quite diverse. You find, for example, that Amsterdam is quite like Copenhagen, high levels of cycling, modest levels of public transport use. Whereas cities like Vienna and Zurich, with historic tram systems, have high level of public transport use and relatively low levels of cycling. What you don't find in European cities are examples of high levels of both cycling and public transport. So I am not that optimistic about being able to get a big increase in cycling in London, because London is a large city geographically, the distances are greater, and has a very good public transport system. Maybe better prospects in smaller UK cities with less good public transport. But then the problem is, if by boosting cycling, you draw people from the buses, you reduce the fare revenue, and either you require more subsidy to maintain the service, or you have a worse service. So there is a real dilemma there. Now, as you know, the Department of Transport published its decarbonisation plan last year, with a strong message about increasing cycling and walking, major investment, 2 billion over 5 years, aiming to have half of all journeys in towns and cities cycle by walk by 2030. And the carbon reductions from that are shown bottom left, 1 to 6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent savings over the 30-year period, 2020 to 2050. Now that's a remarkable figure. Firstly, the range, a 6-fold range, indicates huge uncertainty about the potential impact of cycling on carbon emissions. And secondly, it's very small. On the right-hand side, you see what is projected for the switch of cars to electric propulsion, a range, certainly, but not a huge range. But comparing cycling and car, you see at best the reduction of carbon emissions by cycling is 1% of that attributed to the car, and at worst is near 0.1%. So there's a serious mismatch here between the narrative, which is very positive, and the analysis, which sees minimal consequences of boosting cycling and walking. What's going on here? I think probably ministers wanted to be on the side of the angels, particularly with the then Prime Minister, who was a keen proponent of cycling. But the analysts, the modelers, I think are realistic in recognizing that if you're attracting cyclists from the buses, you're not really going to achieve much in the way of carbon saving, particularly since the buses are being electrified. I think we need to address the attractions of car ownership. As transport planners, we are very conscious of the disadvantages of car ownership. But car ownership is very high, and we need to understand what's going on here. The key point, I think, is door-to-door travel is very convenient by car, where congestion is not a problem and where parking is available at both origin and destination. Now, that's not true in city centres where other modes become much more attractive. Public transport becomes economically more viable, walking and cycling in areas of high population density where catchment areas, whether of schools or supermarkets, are smaller. But beyond city centres, in the suburbs, in the towns, in the rural areas, it seems to me that the car providing door-to-door travel is attractive and will continue to be attractive. And then it's good for longer trips, chain trips, with less sweat if that's your concern. Generally, what we get from mobility is access to people and places, opportunities and choices, of friends and families, of jobs and all the rest. A car really works well for that. And so we have high levels of car ownership and car use, familiar figures, I'm sure. And then there are convenience factors. The striking figure that the RAC Foundation authenticated some time ago, that cars typically are parked for 95% of the time. This is an argument used by the proponents of car sharing to say, you know, if we made better use of cars, there would be economic benefits in sharing. But conversely, the fact we're willing to spend money on something that's parked outside our homes or work 95% of the time is a measure of the value to us of having our own personal vehicle. It's not unique, of course. My washing machine sits around for 95% of the time not used. I could go to the laundrette and share with others, but actually it's convenient to have my own machine when I need it. And finally, there are what I'll call feel-good factors. There are more technical terms for this. One example of this, I think, is the growth of SUVs, the growth in numbers of SUVs. And they're purchased in prosperous urban areas, not in rural areas where a large 4x4 might have practical advantage. There's something about the feel that people have from these vehicles. There's quite a diverse literature on this topic, which is difficult to make much sense of. But one interesting topic, interesting approach, is the notion of car pride that researchers at MIT have developed. They've taken from the social science literature two ideas about pride. One is that it reflects self-esteem, personal achievement, and the other, it reflects position in the social hierarchy. And they developed surveys to understand how car ownership related to pride, which they trialed in US cities and some Chinese cities, and then applied this through telephone interviews internationally. And this is the figure that they come up with, the authors are shown at the top. So they're plotting here on the vertical axis their measure of car pride, and then they're putting in rank order countries just ordered by the level of pride that they're measuring. So on the left-hand side, you've got Japan, the lowest level, then the whole range of European countries, with the UK at the upper end of the European range, and then the US at the upper end of the range of the developed countries, and then beyond that, you've got developing countries. India, for example, here at quite a high level, I imagine reflecting quite a hierarchical society in which car ownership indicates to a degree your position there. So I show this figure because it's the only one I found which quantifies in any way these feel-good factors. It tells us that if we want to get people out of cars, reducing car ownership, it's not enough to offer simply alternative modes of travel, but you also have to address what it is about ownership that matters to people. But the range shown here is very wide, showing that the underlying factors are very varied. And within countries, there'll be quite a wide range. I mean, I guess most people on this webinar would not be very high on a car pride measure. But what we don't understand is the determinants, the underlying determinants of car pride. And if we do want to make progress with transport decarbonisation, it would be a good area for further research. As well as active travel, there are other alternatives to car ownership, which people, I'm sure, will know about. I list them here. I won't talk about these in detail. I cover this in the book. My conclusion is these are at best showing slow growth in niche markets. I don't think any of these will be transformational. And it's partly they're up against competition from the car and public transport, but also because of lack of investment. Now, technology businesses in recent years have attracted a lot of investment, which includes transport technologies, but by no means limited to them. There has been some disillusion, and stock market prices of tech stocks are well down now on what they've been at their peak. For example, Uber attracted a lot of investment when it went public, but its stock market price is now only half what it was at the peak. Venture capital people who would put money into startups with the hope that they could be brought to the stock market in due course, they're now much more cautious. We can recall the experience of dockless bikes, which came and went, and investors lost quite a bit of money in the process. Startup businesses in the areas of electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, electric aircraft are now finding it much more difficult to raise new capital. And I think this will apply to the technologies shown here, including mobility as a service. Now, mobility as a service has been attractive to transport planners because the thought has been that by offering the whole range of alternatives to the car, you would have a better chance of getting people to give up their cars compared with offering single mode alternatives. But by offering a whole range of alternatives, you have operational risk, which then generates investment risk. And moreover, the experience of mobility as a service thus far, I think, is not such as to attract much in the way of private sector investment. Now, there is the possibility of public sector investment, and indeed, the Department of Transport, I understand, is making grant money available for a mobility as a service business in the Solent area. But the question is, when that grant is used up, will they have achieved a viable business model, and will they have been able to show mode shift away from the car? It'll be interesting to see. There's also some scope for redirecting subsidy from conventional bus routes to demand responsive minibuses. And there are some trials of that, but other trials have failed. In general, this is an area where there have been some successes, and these tend to be highlighted, to be cherry-picked, when people are advocating alternatives to car ownership, but there are also a lot of failures. And when you look at the evidence in the whole, my conclusion is these alternatives can make, at best, a limited contribution to decarbonisation. Then there's the impact of the pandemic on travel behaviour, which showed that we could manage with much less travel because of the threat to personal health and lockdown regulations. But on the other hand, as the pandemic has receded, previous travel patterns have largely resumed. Now, there's some exceptions at the present time: less commuting, more working from home, less business travel, more virtual meetings, less use of public transport. Not clear at the moment whether these reflect long-term changes that will persist, or whether there'll be reversion over time to the previous norms. There's a chapter in the book discussing this. It's certainly not impossible that we will get substantial reversion to pre-pandemic travel levels, though maybe some shift of patterns. But I've always been impressed by the hour a day of travel time that's been reported in the National Travel Survey from when it started in the early 1970s to immediately before the pandemic. Of course, during the pandemic, it dropped to 3/4 of an hour a day in 2 pandemic years. But I would expect this to resume at an hour a day over time, reflecting a balance between the time we have for travel in the crowded 24-hour day and the benefits of travel in terms of the access we gain from travel. And if there is less commuting because people are working from home, I would expect there to be more leisure trips to make up for that. If those leisure trips are local trips using active travel, that's very helpful. And if they're trips by car, that's less so. I don't think at the moment one can say there's a clear decarbonisation bonus from reduced car ownership and use as a result of the pandemic. So where does this leave us in our approaches to decarbonising travel? There's new technology where quite rapid progress is happening with electrification of surface transport, particularly cars, with buses and HGVs, buses underway and HGVs lagging somewhat. Aviation is obviously more problematic. And the underlying question is, how far can we rely on technology to achieve our decarbonisation targets, net zero by 2050, but very front-end loaded, 3/4 of that we would like to do by the mid-2030s in order to meet the Paris 1.5 degree limited target. The Department of Transport would like to think we can rely very largely on technology because they can then avoid the difficulty of behavioural change. But my view is behavioural change is really quite difficult to achieve without increasing the cost of carbon-based travel for the reasons I've outlined immediately previously. And it's difficult, of course, to increase the costs of carbon-based travel for reasons of politics and equity of the problem of the low-income motorists needing a car to get to work. And of course, the present climate of energy prices and the response to that makes any change, any increase in cost difficult. So what is it that we can actually do despite these constraints? So my suggestion is that for useful policies, there are 3 criteria. One is we want to achieve substantial carbon reduction, as well as mitigating the other detrimental aspects of the transport system. Secondly, we want policies that are affordable, both to individuals and collectively. And third, that they must have public support so that they're politically feasible. So the first of my 3 suggestions I've already talked about, that's to say regard the road network as mature, aim for operational efficiency, avoid increasing carbon emissions, and saving quite a lot of money in so doing. There's a similar argument, which I won't go into in detail now, but we can discuss. It's discussed in the book, and we can pick it up in discussion if we wish. An argument for not increasing airport capacity, either new runway capacity at Heathrow or new terminals. And then there's an argument for road user charging for electric vehicles on the basis that they need to contribute to the cost of the maintaining the road network. You can't do that immediately because you need lower running costs to compensate for higher capital costs. But it is expected that as battery technology improves, the capital cost of EVs will fall. And when that reaches the capital cost of conventional vehicles, it would be an appropriate time to introduce charging, road user charging for EVs. And I think it would be natural then to have a mechanism which would recognize that London and possibly other cities already have road user charging in the form of the congestion charge in London. And so a unitary mechanism for collecting, but then apportioning the revenue between the exchequer and local authorities. And that seems to me the best way we're ever going to have of actually putting more money into public transport, because the scope for subsidy from local and central government is always going to be limited. So three policies here, which I think are doable, but we need more such policies. And this is where I think transport planners with their holistic view can really make a creative contribution. The final topic I want to talk about is the language we use to talk about what we're doing. And it seems to me it's quite polarized between the very technical and the very simplistic. So the Department of Transport's Transport Analysis Guidance for Appraisal and Modelling generates very substantial reports that go to public inquiries, very technical, complex, opaque, based on modelling, generating benefit cost ratios, but where the modelling can be quite wrong, grossly wrong, as I pointed out earlier in the smart motorway outcome studies. And on the other hand, we have the very simplistic account of what the benefits are supposed to be. And let me quote one example from the Department of Transport recently, announcing some new investments. They said, motorists, pedestrians and cyclists will benefit from reduced congestion and improved connectivity through a £160 million investment for 4 major roads. Now that is grossly simplistic and in my view grossly misleading. So what we need now is language which is accurate enough for professionals to use and intelligible enough for decision makers, stakeholders and the public at large to understand. And what this approach is called heuristics. These are mental shortcuts, rules of thumb, which capture the story in accessible language for all concerned. So I show 2 here, which I've taken from the final chapter of my book. The final chapter is simply a bullet-pointed summary of what's gone before. 2 bullet points shown here. The first one I haven't talked about today, but you'll recognize what's being said. The second one is a summary of the arguments I've been making about the impact of cycling. Now, I recognize this is probably not what most transport planners have been advising, nor is it what most transport planners would want to be advising the people they deal with. But it is, I think, what they should be advising based on the available evidence. Now, of course, new evidence can come to light, and one should always be open to the possibility that new evidence may change what we wish to say. But based on the existing evidence, then to me, this is what I think transport planners should be saying when advising about cycling. And if you go beyond that in your enthusiasm for cycling, we know transport planners are very enthusiastic generally about cycling, then you raise expectations that won't be met. You raise expectations for impact on carbon emissions that won't be met. Now, I should say that my attempt to summarize in accessible bullet point form what I've said in the book stops short in that I cannot at this stage see neat rules of thumb telling us how to decarbonize transport. Analysis of policy and the policy options hasn't yet developed far enough. And again, this is where transport planners may be able to help developing a story so that we can generate the language that can be widely understood for what needs to be done. So finally, this is the book. I hope if I've been able to interest you in the kind of analysis that I think needs to be done, as well as the conclusions, that you will have a look at the book and engage with the issues there. So with that, let me conclude. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the ensuing discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, you did a pretty good job of picking out most of the greatest hits of the book, but as I say, there's a fair number of little tabs in there. There's a lot more that we could have gone into, so I would definitely encourage people to go out and get the book. Certainly, actually, I found it to be a really useful tome, a reference tome as to how we got to this position. Having all that information all in one place actually was really, really valuable, and not something that I'd really come across before. So thank you for giving us a bluffer's guide on all of that. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just turn to our panelists just to offer some reflections on what David has said and maybe their own thoughts on this subject. I'm delighted to start with Professor Gillian Annabel, who's the Chair of Transport and Energy at the Institute of Transport Studies in Leeds, and also, perhaps more importantly, Transport Planner of the Year. Gillian, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. Thank you. But mostly thank you to David, of course, and also many congratulations. I mean, writing books is just a phenomenal achievement, and of course, you've done this many times now. And I certainly echo Mark's comments that you've done. You've pulled out in your presentation there some of the really interesting bits, but the book itself is a real tour de force. And I think that as soon as you try and take on the topic of transport decarbonisation, of course, you're taking on everything. It's not just a sort of, one area. Decarbonising the transport system, the whole point is that it involves everything. It's about understanding how we've got to this point, which of course you do very well. It's about understanding the scope for change. What do we know about how change happens and where it happens and over what timescales? That of course leads us on to understanding how we model it, whether we actually can model it, do model it, and you've touched on all of that, as well as then touching on some of the key ways in which we try and shake out this debate around technology versus behaviour. And so on. So I think it's really great. And I'm going to give a spoiler alert, which is that that I forgot. I did write down the page number, but it's certainly towards really the end. And there is a sentence which says, "We have left it too late to do this without pain." And in essence, to me, I mean, it's not the most important sentence in the book by any means, because it doesn't, what does it actually help us to do or understand? But it's certainly for me the framing that I bring to everything that I do now on transport is thinking about what the timescales are that we're working to, and that leads then to some criticism, debate that we can have about the fact that as soon as you diagnose the fact that we haven't got very long to do what we need to do, and therefore we're only left with some quite painful decisions. It's all very well diagnosing the problem, saying what we have to do, but that's not the same as saying what we can do. And David sort of touches on this, I think, a lot in the book. He doesn't pull any punches in saying, you know, there's a lot of wishful thinking around all of this. And one of the things that he focuses on is, or he suggests, is that we need a consensus on the need for behaviour change. And this sort of kept popping up one way or the other in the book, and I kept thinking, do we? I thought, you know, surely there's a consensus that we do need behaviour change. I think one of the problems is that there is a difference to the carbon budgets that people are working to in this space. So depending on what you believe the transport sector is responsible for will lead you to different conclusions as to just how urgent the problem is. If you put quite a lot of responsibility on the transport sector and you link the modelling that you do up to the energy system and therefore the carbon system, there is a lot of consensus that says that we really have only got about 8 to 10 years left of doing things the way that we're doing them now, even with quite an optimistic trajectory for electric vehicles. We're going to blow all the budget for the transport sector in the next 8 to 10 years. And when they run that through, that involves really quite a lot of behaviour change required. And then the other assumptions that make the difference to mean that we perhaps don't have the consensus is, what are we assuming about traffic growth and what generates traffic growth? Because although we understand quite a lot of the relationships in the past, the point is, have they changed? Are there generational differences? You know, are there technologies that will come in and mean that the way in which people make decisions and the travel patterns they have will change? Then there are technological assumptions around, well, what's going to happen to the car fleet? We focus on electric vehicles over here and we take our eye off the ball on the fact there's an awful lot that's happening in the internal combustion engine vehicles, including size inflation and so on. And it's assumptions around that can make some real differences. So the point is that although we've got some consensus around certain areas, there's huge scope for differences in opinions depending on how urgent you think the problem is. I think there's really strange things that can happen in the debate, regardless of the timescale in some ways that you're working towards, in that we turn the decarbonisation conversation around electric vehicles and how quickly we can get them in the fleet. And that's one big area that we talk about, and then we focus on cycling and active travel in the other. And yet most of the travel we do is in the intermediate length of journeys, the longer distance journeys. That's where the miles and the carbon is. There's lots of intermediate solutions around destination shifting, not just mode shifting, around thinking about the size of the vehicles, and around looking at where behaviour change has actually happened. And this is where I think I differ with some of the things that David says in the book. He's more pessimistic than I am in terms of behaviour change. So, for instance, you emphasise an awful lot, David, that COVID, the changes that happen in the pandemic are unlikely to stick. And I understand why you say that. However, we are not back to normal. Car traffic is still depressed. Road traffic isn't, but car traffic is, particularly in the peak hours. It's still only at around 92% of pre-pandemic levels. If pre-pandemic we had achieved an 8% reduction in car traffic, we would be having a completely different attitude to the prospects for behaviour change. And so my argument is, while I understand that it is very difficult to change behaviour and that we haven't done it successfully, the point is that we haven't looked at where it has changed enough and figured out where it's changed and why it's changed in those particular examples. And so I think two final points. One is that I think we need to be more, identify more about what we do know about how behaviour changes, rather than sort of saying things like we don't understand, you know, people's motivations, or we don't understand how it changes. I think there are examples of where it changes. And the other thing is around the whole piece around acceptability. So if we are saying we can only do this without some hardships and some pain, then we are saying we've got to try, and we can't jump to the idea that then just go round in a circle and say we've got to do it but we can't do it, and just keep going around this dance. And I think we've got to have a much more honest conversation about the fact that we can only do this with pain, and we've got to have that conversation openly with the public and start to talk about the trade-offs that we've got to make, rather than sort of shirking our responsibility around how much pain is actually involved.
It's a nice optimistic point to end on there, Gillian. As somebody who's often been described as the most inspirational pessimist in this discussion, just to hear that you're less pessimistic than someone is striking. David, do you want just a very quick minute just to reflect on some key points there, and then I'll bring Steve in.
Sorry, you're asking me to?
Did you want to reflect, or we can go straight to Steve? Up to you.
Yes. I mean, the thing is, we're working in a democracy where, you know, the electorate is important, both local and national levels, where the decarbonisation agenda extends far beyond transport. Transport is one of the easier ones to manage technologically because of electric vehicles being available, and possibly later on running a scrappage scheme for internal combustion engine vehicles to accelerate the process, which you could contemplate doing when sufficient EVs come on the market, on the second-hand market. But other sectors of the economy are much more difficult, like home heating, heat pumps in old buildings, and the whole agricultural sector. So, and then the wider context, the global context, is one in which many countries are still building coal-fired power stations. So there's a limit to what, you know, the voters will accept in terms of pain in changing travel behaviour. There are things you could do in a more authoritarian system like China or maybe Singapore, if you were seized with the problem, which are difficult, probably not possible to do here. So this is the thing, you know, how do you exercise pain in a democratic society? If it comes from outside, a war in Ukraine impacting on gas, and people will kind of live with that, but the government has to come to their rescue. But if it's self-inflicted, as they will see it from a government policy, which is being driven by modelling, which is complex, opaque and contested, very dependent upon assumptions, optimism bias, pessimism bias, all operating. I think it's really quite difficult to ask for big behavioural change in the transport sector in this context, which leaves us with the problem of what we do. Let me stop there, Mark.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, David. Okay, so if I can turn now to Steve Gooding. Steve is the director of the RAC Foundation and has been known to be a civil servant as well from time to time. Steve, let's have your reflections on David.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I'll start off by congratulating the TPS on its anniversary, which I think is a great thing. I am a happy, proud member of the CIHT and the CILT, and very keen on entities, organisations like the TPS that promote knowledge and professionalism. So very pleased to be here this evening. Golly, I mean, David's given us, I feel a bit like Andrew Adonis, who I used to work for. I've written down 19 points here, but I'm not going to go through them because life is too short. I think I'll just pick out four things here that strike me from the conversation so far, some of which chime, you know, I agree with a lot of what David says. I agree with quite a bit of what Gillian says. I think you'll find nuances of difference between, I suspect, all four of us this evening. Let's start with the first one, which is one of my favourites. Something that the transport planning world has to cope with. The only thing we can say with certainty about the future is that it hasn't happened yet, right? Everything else is to play for. And we can try and predict it, and we can try and shape it, and we can try and ask ourselves, what do we want it to be like? And I think we need to be in the latter category in all of the professions we're working in. That's my point one. Point two, I've seen a lot in the chat about the terminology of subsidy versus investment and all of those sorts of good things. Personally, I think we have a cultural hang-up in this country about whether we call it subsidy or investment, about public expenditure, right? And we've got to be clear, the environment we're working in, at least, where are we? It's just gone 7 o'clock. Some members have dropped off to listen to the archers. Just gone 7 o'clock. I think Liz Truss is still the Prime Minister. And if that's the case, we have a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who are absolutely clear that the best way to have a happy country is for people to be taxed less and hold on to more of the money themselves. That's what they believe. Now, it's no part of my agenda at the RSE Foundation to get into the politics of this, but if that's what they think, and highly experienced professionals in the TPS think, well, we don't agree with that. We think you should spend more money on the railway and do something to improve the service and do something to cut fares. You're sort of hitting a brick wall, I think, I fear. So we've seen the Shamps-Williams review been put on ice for the moment again. We're not sure where that's going, but it leads me to my third point, which is about the fact that when we're thinking about, okay, what should the members of the TPS be doing about all this? What should they be thinking? When I was back in the civil service, 2015 and way beyond, including the years that David was there, with the policy profession that I worked in, we came up with basically, we called it a 3-ring circus. There are 3 things that policy officials have to be on top of. They are evidence, deliverability, and politics. And that means you've got to know what you're talking about. If you're proposing something, you better be pretty confident you can make it work. And third, you don't have to be a politician, but you do have to understand where the politicians you're putting your advice to are coming from. Now, one of the things that TPS members are going to have to deal with is that political view at the local level can be at significant variance to the political view at the national level. I hold up as an example to you this week, Cambridge and Cambridgeshire, right? Here we have an area that is about to go to public consultation on a package of transport measures, which includes a congestion charge. I don't know whether Anne-Marie Trevelyan thinks this is a good idea, but if you ask me to bet money, I don't think she's going to come rampaging out in huge support of it. Don't know, let's see. So that's just a fact of life. And it sort of leads me my last point here, which is about politics is all about the pain gain. So we've heard quite a bit about, is it too late, or if we're going to change behavior, is that going to be painful? Well, all behavior change is in a sense painful, because what it means is I'm going to stop you doing what you would otherwise have chosen to do. And if you look at it on that level, well, of course it's painful. Of course, my instinctive reaction is sod off. But if, as a profession, we are able to say, you've got to look at our package in the round. You've got to look at what we're saying, not just as transport stuff. Let's remember this, right? Derived demand, we all know that as transport professionals. We're not here to worry about trips. Actually, we're worrying about whether people can get to work, get to school, get to facilities, get deliveries to their homes. That's what we're facilitating, a healthy, successful population and economy. Then I come back to, sometimes the job that we've got is to say, I know that the option I'm offering you comes with a degree of pain, but the evidence I'm now going to show you is the pain you're going to feel if we don't do this, it's actually worse. And in my experience, there are few things as painful to a government department as is the loss of income to the Treasury. So we need to be looking at the decline of fuel duty income. And I think a lively debate is starting, with or without the government's engagement, about what's to be done about that. And David's said, and I think wisely, We need to start thinking what we're going to do with the electric vehicles, because clearly they're not going to pay fuel duty. The idea of putting a premium on those right now when we're trying to encourage people into them, I don't think that passes the politics test right now. But here's my last point. All professions are guardians of the long term. And we need to be thinking, what do we do now and say now and engage with now in the political environment we are in now, including taking into account the political timescales, local elections next year, probably a national general election the year after that, if not sooner. So we've got to think about that. But we also have to be allowing part of our brain to be thinking, yes, 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 but transport, you need to think about in decades, not in months. So those would be the things that I would say for people on the call. That's where I would like the TPS to be putting its thinking.
Some things to add to our to-do list there, Steve. Thank you for that. David, do you want to come back on any of those points quickly before we turn to Anna?
No, let Anna say her piece.
Excellent, brilliant. Okay, we're going to bring in Anna Rothley, who's the Principal Transport Planner at MOTS, and comes with some particular expertise around engaging people, and maybe has some insights onto this issue about how we can encourage people to understand the situation that we are in.
Thank you, Mark, and echo all the presenters' points so far about David's book. I am, as a millennial, my attention span, I think, struggles a bit. So, it was a real mission to read a book. I did, and I really enjoyed it, and I took so many notes that I'm going to kind of, as Steve has done, I've kind of summarized 4 kind of themes that I wanted to kind of feed back. But as I was listening to the other panelists, I was really thinking about how much we need to think and act differently, and maybe one of the best ways to do that is actually to listen more to younger people, because ultimately the younger people are the ones that are going to be dealing with the fallout from all of this, and I think that we have the potential as younger people, I don't know if I can call myself young anymore, relatively young, to just think and act very differently than we may be expected to, and as has been seen in the past. So I'm really keen to kind of get that point across about, the potential for the future to change, and be more optimistic, as Gillian has been as well. But I wanted to just start by making a point about the fact we're now in the 4th industrial revolution, and that sometimes I look out in the physical world and it feels like I'm stuck literally 100 years ago. There are literally massive big machines. I live in Bristol. I live in like a kind of in our suburby Victorian type street. And it just makes me so depressed when I go out of my house and I see all these vehicles, like massive vehicles in the public space, taking up the room, like just space unnecessarily. They're most of the time, as David quotes, obviously the 95% that we all know and love so well. But 80% of us live in urban areas. This statistic never fails to shock me to the core, because there's always someone that makes the point about rural. I literally grew up at the top of a hill in the middle of Scotland in a multi-car household. As I'm sure other people on the call grew up in rural areas as well, or are in rural areas. I understand very well the challenges that people in rural areas face, but so many of us live in urban areas. Why do we not embrace technology more? Why do we not embrace spatial proximity more? And how do we use digital and the digital age that we're increasingly finding ourselves in, and it's increasingly going to evolve to tip us towards spending less time traveling? David, which I know you've made the point about the hour, and I do actually travel an hour a day by foot, I'm glad to say, but it adds to the value of my day. Walking for an hour a day adds to the value of my day. I don't think it's taking away from anyone. One question I have, and I don't know if anyone else finds this, but my tolerance for long distance travel since the pandemic has gone way down. I used to ping pong up and down to Scotland. I'm having to do it again 4 times the end of this year up on the train, which has cost me a freaking fortune. Let's not broach that topic. But I just don't have the energy and the care anymore to be traveling around all over the place. If someone asks me, I did a bid on the Maldives, and someone was like, "Oh, we'll fly you over for a 4-hour meeting." I was literally like, that's a ridiculous idea. I don't even want to do that. It's just silly. It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, the tolerance for long distance travel, I think, is a really interesting thing. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that kind of reduced tolerance, and potentially an impact of that on our travel habits. Younger generations, I felt a sense as I read your book, David, about the increasing feeling I have that we need to shape the future. We need to decide what it is we want to see, and we need to come up with creative and new ways to get there. We don't have to just do what's been done in the past. We can do things differently. We can behave differently. and we can develop places differently. I know that's obviously a much slower process, but the digital sphere really allows us to we can use that as a tool to shape the future and do things differently, kind of digital side of things. I think that the generational shift of power, I do scenario planning is my day job. So, this is one of the most interesting factors to me, is how the voters and how the values that people have, the experiences people have, will continue to shift the society we live in and the decisions that are made. And I think that's really interesting. And the young people growing up now, like I was almost 2018, obviously, when Greta rang the alarm bell on the climate crisis, and I'd already been kind of aware of, the climate and things before that. But that was a point, the end of my formative point in my life, but still quite early enough that I've seen the way we used to live and the kind of bubble of happiness we used to live in, and ignorance of like, oh, we can do anything we want and have a great time and fly all over the world and no one cares, to now the reality of like my life, the experiences I'm going to have and how different they might be to the generations before me. And I'm, coming from a relatively privileged position, saying that, having those opportunities to do so. There's so many people without even that glimpse of, privilege. So yeah, I think generational shift of power and the younger people coming up and changing things will be really interesting, and how that plays out. Again, like Steve says, we don't know. No one knows the future. I really want to see us move away from the car as the default though, and it's kind of used as the benchmark for everything. I actually have never owned my own car. Like I said, I grew up in a multi-car household. I've had access to a car growing up, but I genuinely love not having a car. Like I live in a city, of course. People will always say, well, I can't do that. I have kids and whatever. I don't have kids as well. So, it's great. My genuine life goal is never to own a car. I do not want to own a car. It costs money. It ruins the planet. It takes up space from other people. It's dangerous. Like, I just don't want to own one. And I don't know why more people don't sell not having a car as a thing, because, it is an option for many people. They just don't want to accept it. And with living costs coming in and like I say, I'm relatively privileged as a young person. I have expendable income, but there's so many people that don't have money to spend on things like cars and houses and all the things that we've been told in society are really important for us to have status and all these things. But that view is changing as well. So it's an interesting thing what we spend our increasingly limited money on, especially as younger people. I also wonder, you used the word intrinsic benefit of car ownership and the kind of car pride point, David didn't. I wonder how much intrinsic benefits for all of us there are with less cars. Like, it's not just about the individual, and this is another generational thing. Younger generations don't just think about the individual, they think about society, especially global, national, local. Like, we're thinking more about, it's not just about us, it's about everyone else and our impacts on that, on the world. And the point about the washing machine, your washing machine is not parked on my street. So to me, like, it's a different comparison. I've often thought about this as well. I've often thought, oh, but we don't share microwaves and we don't share ovens and we don't share this. But then I just thought yesterday, I was like, but I don't have to go out the street and see your washing machine parked on my street. So that's kind of, to me, the difference. And that point is like, they are taking up public space. They are causing me pollution. They're causing me freaking whatever, shortening my life, whatever they're doing to me. I think, Gillian, your point about having an honest conversation, I totally agree. And I think that honest conversation needs to be about the future of the car and the future of the role of the car. To me, it is the elephant in the room. As transport professionals, we all say that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people out of the car. David, you talk about this in your book quite often, but we never really address it in public, and no one ever comes out and says, this is a problem we need to tackle. All we do is slap sticks on people like congestion charges without actually giving the message. And when you look at the chart of smoking, you see that we introduced all these policies like taxes and things, but the big drop was when the messaging came out from government saying, this is going to kill you, this is going to give you cancer, this is bad for you. And I think there needs to be more honest messaging about the whole impact that our transport system and all of it has on people. Like, people need to be told the truth about, the full impacts of our decisions on our technologies that we use and whatever. And I'd like to also say the point about pride, I'd like to counter it by saying, kind of asking the question, does driving bring out the worst in people and society? I see a lot of inequality, the whole SUV argument, the power that people feel like they have in a car, that to come out and demand that low neighborhood street is not put in because, I'll limit my ability to drive through with my SUV. The greed of like the space that they take up, of the kind of fossil fuels they're using, and the anger that comes with them often. I see car drivers being quite, aggressive and kind of angry a lot of the time. So yeah, I wonder if driving can bring out the worst in us and a very primal side of us that I would quite like to see a world with less of. And that's my points. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anna. David, reflections on that and also Steve's contribution, but maybe specifically this point about generational change, and maybe Gillian, you might want to come in on this as well. Do we have hope that this generation is different? I don't think I am. I'm not a millennial. I think I might just be actually, but I'm lying really if I'm honest. Is it could it be different? And if so, would that mean that some of these sort of almost these things that are written in law that you've talked about in the book, the hour a day and the access and the speed and all that sort of stuff might change? What's your take on that?
I mean, I think there are generational changes happening. In part, the deferral of entry into adult life from sort of historically, say, the early 20s, now 10 years later, maybe, because of more people going to higher education, going to cities, high-density cities, where you don't need a car, not part of the lifestyle, for the agglomeration benefits, which are both economic in terms of job opportunities and the rest, but also social. Dating apps work best where you've got high population density because you find more potential partners within the neighborhood. But then, so it's deferral of entry to adult life, people having their first child later. But then I think you get the movement out of the high density city centre to the suburbs to have families and bring up children, and then the car becomes quite attractive with small children, etc. And the basic attraction of the car, for all its faults, the basic attraction is the access it gives people to the people and places they want to get to, which is both employment, a whole variety of services, family, friends, and the rest of it, without which they may feel deprived. So that's the problem. The fundamental attraction of the car, I think, will remain despite all the disadvantages and despite some generational delay. And I think the problem for transport planners is really, I mean, what Anna said is very interesting, is her perspective, that of a professional transport planner advising clients as to what to do, because it sounded much more like a personal view of how the world should be. And so what is the role of a transport planner? Is it to be an analyst first and foremost, identifying the options for decision makers to choose from? Or should transport planners also be prepared to be advocates and say, this is how the world ought to be, and try and persuade decision makers to see it that way? I mean, as a former civil servant myself, and before that as a research scientist, my predisposition is to do the analysis. The first question I want to ask is, what's going on here? And when I've got an answer to that, I can then ask the second question, what can we do about it? But if you're an advocate, you'll jump more to the second question because it's urgent to do something about it. But then the risk is that the outcomes will not be what you expect because there are unintended consequences that you hadn't worked through and so forth. So I think there's a kind of an issue for transport planners as to what is the true nature of professionalism, as between the emphasis on analysis of options as against the advocacy of preferred solutions.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, David, and certainly through both CIHT and TPS, we've done a lot of work on the idea of constructive challenge. So, to be able to play this stuff back to decision makers to say there are consequences from doing this action, and therefore you must know about those consequences. And transport planners have a duty, and Transport Planning Society members have a duty through the Code of Conduct Society to make sure that they do take that. Now, that obviously can be very difficult and challenging in a client situation, but nonetheless it's absolutely critical. And I think Glenn Professor Glenn Lyons makes a good point that we can spend a long time waiting for government to change guidance and or change web tag or whatever. Actually, collectively, transport planners, if we decide that we think this is a really important thing, we can move much more quickly and much more agilely, and hence the reason why all this stuff is now baked into the transport planning professional, the chartership for transport planners, because of that. Gillian, do you want to reflect on the generational change piece?
Oh, I want to reflect on so many things. I mean, I will just pick up on this business about what the sort of responsibility of what the responsibility is that we have. I mean, certainly one of the things that really screams at me when I think about the answer to that question is that we have the responsibility to stop using analytical tools that we know are broken and don't work anymore. And we've got a responsibility to stop valuing things really highly that we know are actually not valued by people, such as travel times, minuscule travel time savings, etc., etc. So there's something really fundamental about the tools that we use, and we've got a responsibility to fix them, because they're at the heart of so many of the things that we do and end up informing decision makers about. I think the other responsibility we have is, as it was said earlier, we've got the responsibility to communicate what the pain that will be if we don't do some of these things, and that's where I think, or I hope, I don't know if it's I don't know if it's wishful thinking or whatever it is, but this is where what Anna was saying about potentially the younger generation have some different values and some different perspectives on the future. Of course they're going to have different perspectives on the future. They're younger than the rest of us that they've got a lot of the demand that we're talking about suppressing, they haven't even done yet. We're not talking necessarily about changing behavior, we're talking about changing future possible behaviors and preventing certain things from happening. That's really quite different. If we can think about that, that's much more in the realms of visioning what sort of future we want, and one that fits with the decarbonisation agenda. And I think I think that's the responsibility, is to be much more about what we want and what young people, what values and so on young people are actually making their decisions on, and those are the things that we don't understand enough about.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. David, do you want to reflect on that? I'd like to bring Steve in as well on a separate issue.
No, let me pass.
Okay.
There are other people who want to contribute, I guess.
Yeah, that's helpful. We talked a lot about the sort of the. So what extent can the transport sector solve all of this? I mean, there's clearly lots of reasons with derived demand, all of that sort of stuff. To what extent do we look outside of our sector to try and help us with this? And, I'm bringing in ideas such as triple access planning here that have been talked about. So bringing in digital services, not just in terms of using digital services to influence travel demand, but to remove travel demand, to extract it. Obviously, there's the land use planning piece, but I mean, I completely take your point, and Anna mentioned it as well, that this is a longer term perspective, but nonetheless is important to get it right now, to take Steve's challenge, think now what we need in 4 decades time. And to what extent can we look at all of those pieces in order to be able to try and influence this sort of access conundrum that you talk about? Should transport planners really be investing in corner shops to stop people having to travel by car outside of their car desert housing development, for example? Is that an intervention that's more likely to be successful than 4 kilometres of cycle lane? I don't know.
At the moment, I would definitely counsel to think twice before you invest in a corner shop, because I spend my days trying to work from home, interrupted by a never-ending stream of people in vans who hurl packages at the house, which I've paid for, but I've no idea what they are or why they're being delivered. I would set up a coffee shop, is what I'd do based on current form, and I think that is part of the future of of those office workers amongst us who've decided to forego the commute and to spend more time at home and want to nevertheless be in a social situation. Sorry, David, I cut across you.
No, I'm just going to say the problem is the environments that we inherited and mostly we value is hard to change, whereas our vehicle fleets turn over with an average life of cars of 15 years. We live in our Victorian houses, leaky in terms of energy, located where they are. And nearly all the property is in private ownership. So it's quite difficult for planners in local government and elsewhere to sort of change access by changing the environment. And this, in a way, locks us into car-based travel that we have. I mean, it's not just, the kind of Los Angeles type city, which is wholly car dependent because of when it was built. It's our existing cities, dating from the 19th century, which British cities are relatively low density compared with many continental cities of much higher density. So there is room to park the cars at curbside if we don't have front drives, and it does take up the space and can offend some, as Anna was pointing out. But that's where we are, and it is quite hard to change that. And when I say this, it's not because I'm of a conservative disposition. I'm just kind of looking at the reality. So certainly, in terms of transport investment, it should not be within a transport analysis silo. It should be jointly with the urban planners and with the developers to decide where development should take place and what the transport requirement is. And so, for example, in London, there's been a lot of high density apartments being built adjacent to tube stations, which makes sense. And those apartments won't have car parking on the premises and won't have car parking rights in the street. And that's a good example of policy, which you can do in a city like London, which has a mayor who's responsible for planning, for housing, overall housing strategy, and for transport. And that's why, the governance of city regions is important for getting good urban transport decisions. But when you go beyond that, the National Planning Policy Framework gives far too little guidance to actually end up with a sensible range of transport investment.
Steve, do you want to come in on that?
Thank you. Well, it wasn't exactly the same point, but a couple of other reflections, really. So one of the stats Anna had there was 80% of us live in cities. But I think the reality is 80% of us live in conurbations. I didn't grow up in the wilds in the countryside. I grew up in SE9 between Greenwich and Woolwich. And I had cause to go back there recently. And it's the same rather gloomy place, characterized by semi-detached, largely, houses, many of them built post-war. Practically every house has a front garden. Practically every front garden has been paved and has at least one, often two vehicles, sometimes a van and a car, sometimes two cars and a van. Very rarely anything less than that. And I think we've got a second point, really. Everything we do is about real places. And one of the hang-ups I've long had with transport, with my former colleagues back in the day, is to start talking about things in abstract when you really need to start talking about them like there. So, I'm very much in favor where David started us today. Let's look at two real places and how you get between them. So when we're working as professional transport planners, I suspect the first question we should be asking our customers is, well, what do you want this place to be like? Because I think that should be the thing that's fueling it. What do you want it to be like? Could we come up with a mood board for what you want the place to be like, whether it's Bristol or whether it's Haywards Heath where I live, or whether it's in a large country estate with tennis courts and swimming pool where David lives? I mean, you've got to think about the actual place and think about what you want it to be like. Third, we have for many years, I think, regarded a significant benefit that's come from personal transport as being an agglomeration of skills and labour force that's enabled employers to go to one place and attract all of the talented people they need from a pretty wide geographical area. And outside of London and potentially, I guess, maybe Manchester, maybe Birmingham, maybe parts of Bristol, that's been people going by car. Now, for some of those companies, they still need those people because they're doing jobs that you need to be there to do. And you've got to, that's where you need to be thinking, okay, the planning system only works on a certain cycle, but are there things that could be done with those employers? My long-held view is the only way that car sharing ever successfully gets promoted is when employers say, those are the spaces you can have, but you can only have them if you joined our company car club. And that means there's going to be at least 2 of you in every vehicle. Otherwise, you don't get parked. Brutal, but that's what I think has to happen to make that work. But I think for office jobs, what we're seeing is a lessening of that. I've tried to recruit people to the RSE Foundation in the last couple of years and told them they need to come into London at least once a fortnight. And the reaction has been from one perfectly good candidate, yeah, but I live in Shetland. I don't really want to come to London once a fortnight. How about twice a year? Well, it doesn't really fit with the job. Some of the stuff we do is in person. So, but I think one of the really big issues, looking at the latest DFT data, and I always hate to argue with Gillian because I usually end up being wrong, but the latest numbers DFT's published about traffic and public transport usage for the first week of this month is that car traffic is up at, I think, 102% pre-COVID. HGV and van traffic is way above 100%. The big hits have been to National Rail and to the Tube. And that's telling me it's the London commuter market that's taken the biggest hit, and that was an office market. So again, when we're asking ourselves, what do you want this place to be like? One of the challenges, one of the things that TfL has to think about is the extent to which the success of London was based on people like me who don't live there, going there every day. And now I don't, and frankly, I have no intention of going there every day. And I'll go there sometimes. Maybe that's a feature of what Anna was saying about my tolerance for travel. I've certainly got less tolerance for rail travel. And I offer you 3 words on that one: Avanti West Coast.
That's a particularly cheery point to end on there, Steve. I'm conscious of the time. I see we've lost a couple of participants, so I suggest that we look to round up. Gillian, I think you wanted to come back on that. Do you want to do so and offer some sort of final reflections, and then I'll come to you, Anna, then to you, Steve, quickly, and then to David, and then we'll go and get some dinner.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I was going to come back on the COVID traffic figures, just because, Steve, you're right, actually, and I haven't looked at the most up-to-date figures. But what I do think with this 100%, 102% is that obviously it's an average. What has been happening over the months is that peak hour traffic is significantly down. During the week, traffic is significantly down, and it's weekend traffic that has bounced right back up and over the top. And that's important because even in the conversation that we've had, and we've tried to really kind of get real with what this issue is around decarbonisation, we do focus back in on the local travel and the urban environment. That's all important, but it is a fact that it's the long distance travel that is growing and that eats up most of the carbon. And in David's book, he uses the example of Copenhagen to illustrate the limited scope for reducing car use. I have the equivalent kind of example where I trot out about the Netherlands and how we know how much cycling goes on over there. 29% of trips compared to whatever it is, 1.5%, 2% here. The average per capita carbon footprint of traveling of Dutch people versus British people is exactly the same. Why? Because they like their large cars and they like to use them a lot on long distance travel. And so then I'll just finish by, I suppose, repeating some of what I've said, but I think we don't we don't go to, and what others have said, we don't often go to the hard truths. We've got to talk about the role of the car. We've got to talk about long distance journeys. We can't keep trying to be authoritative voices on decarbonisation if we're not talking about what the really big problems are, and we keep getting deflected and sort of off track because we're just not going to make enough progress. That's not to say I know what the answers are about those big difficult problems, but it's all in the spirit or in the necessity of being honest and having an honest conversation about what the problems are. Because maybe I shouldn't end on this point, but that honesty is necessary, because if I'm honest, I don't think we've got a hope in what's it of achieving decarbonisation in the transport sector. And I actually think what the TPS webinars are going to be pretty darn soon. I'm not sure quite the timescale, but they're all going to be about mitigation, because one way or another, demand is coming down. We're either going to reduce demand because we know we have to, or demand is going to be reduced for us, and we're going to be trying to figure out how to deal with that harm. So my prediction is we're going to be having lots more webinars about adaptation. Sorry about that negative note, but
I think we've already seen that, and obviously the summer's weather has really focused people's minds on that. I can't remember what order I said actually, but Anna, do you want to say a few words of summing up, and then I'll do Steve, and then David, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I just wanted to come back on your point, David, about kind of being a transport professional and our role in advocacy. And it's quite interesting because, yeah, I spent a lot of time alone that year that the kind of climate crisis was really like the bell was ringing. And I really I was alone too much. I was in my own head too much. And I really I wanted to kind of get into that more like activist space and kind of, do something, because, you feel like that's important. But at the same time, I don't like conflict. And where I'm getting to with this point of view is like, we need to find a way that works for us to express our own agency, to try and have a little influence. So for me, I'm certainly not a professor, I'm not even a researcher. I'm a very passionate person. I work in the industry. I'm totally a massive transport nerd, like I'm sure everyone else on the call is. And so for me, it's like, how do I like ideas. I like thinking about the future. So for me, my contribution is to try and get people to think differently and kind of challenge thinking. So that's kind of, I just wanted to come back on that point, because I think it's a really interesting one. And I've heard references to kind of advocacy versus activism before. And I'd like to my personal views, I like to sit in the advocacy space and try and craft it out in hopefully a professional way. I realize I may have used some swear words in my talk. I hope I didn't in hindsight. But yeah, passionate and an advocate, and what I do is all about the future, so I'm keen to try and have an impact. But in terms of other reflections, my mind's gone blank. I'm not much of an evening person, and unless I've had a gin, so I'm going to pass over to
Thanks, Anna. And in respect to the blue language, we'll put the trigger warnings on the video recording. So it's fine. Steve, go on.
I'm sorry, I was just thinking about gin. So what I would say is, for me, many of the things we've said do come back to thinking about actual places and thinking about, but you can't plan transport in abstract. There's no such thing as an average road or an average place in many ways. You've got to think about real places and real travel, how it is today and how it could be. I'm all for passionate advocacy and a fairly lively debate. I thought there's an issue about those average transport statistics. There are two statistics we've talked about the DFT's travel data and about our number for the number of days a car spends, the proportion of its life a car spends. That still, they're both averages. I actually personally hate averages because they mask an awful lot of things. So the traffic thing does mask, as Gillian said to us, what's actually happening at peak hours in particular places, in different types of places, in suburbs, at weekends as opposed to weekdays. All of those are things that we need to be challenging ourselves on. Long distance journeys, yes, we need to think about those. And we need to think, whether in those cars that are sat still for 95% of their lives, let's not worry about them perhaps. I mean, they're going to offend Anna I'm sorry, because they're going to be parked on your street. But if they're parked on your street, they aren't going anywhere. And maybe we need to focus in carbon terms on the ones that are racking up the miles. And lastly, just to complicate things, of course, we need to think about the whole life carbon impact of those vehicles. And the lovely big Volvo that I was talking about, the Coventry Cathedral size one, they're producing a battery electric one next year. I just wonder how many 100,000 miles you're going to have to do in that vehicle to actually even out the carbon footprint of that vehicle. And I would just hope not too many people on the narrow streets of Bristol decide to buy a vehicle that big. But I do want to end on a positive. So I do want to take us back to another thing that Gillian said, which is, why don't we go back and have a look at when those numbers were going in a different direction, even if they have bounced back? Ask ourselves, yes, okay, they bounced back. We later understand why that is. But when they came down, was life really so bad?
Yeah, when we all lived essentially in centre parks, it was all right, wasn't it? Okay, brilliant. David, I'll give you the honour of the last word. I wouldn't even bother trying to sum it all up, but it'd be great to get your final perspectives on this. I had about 16 questions here, which none of which I've asked, and I see that colleagues have also posted questions in the Q&A. I'd be interested in your responses to that, and we can get, if you get a moment after the seminar to write a few words down, that would be good. I think in particular, I would love to explore this whole digital platform piece and to what extent policy professionals can use this to influence behaviour and actually and change behaviour rather than just being a rather passive consumer tool is what it is at the moment. That seems like a really interesting space, and as a practitioner who would dearly have loved to have been able to do that when I was in the middle of the LTN wars, that would be a great space to be able to have a more collaborative approach with, but we haven't had time to do that, and I'm taking up more of your time, so I'm going to pass over to you to finish up.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for organising the meeting and allowing me to outline the approach adopted in my book, and thanks everyone for the contributions in the chat, which I look forward to reading at leisure and absorbing later on. I mean, my general sense is that the transport planning profession isn't where it ought to be in relation to the issues we've been discussing. There's a lot of ideas around, and there are attitudes and different approaches, and the thing needs to gel in some way. So as professionals, one can advise the clients, if you want to reduce the carbon footprint of your activity, these are the things you could do based on agreed evidence and judgment of professionals. And this is what can be contributed. My sense is we're not there yet at all. And the question perhaps for the society is whether it wants to be active as a professional group moving this forward, or whether perhaps it's outside the scope and therefore one might need another mechanism for doing it. I've been struck by what some lawyers are doing. A bunch of lawyers have recognized climate change is happening. They're saying this introduces new risks which our clients need to recognize and mitigate and accept responsibility for. And what they're doing in practice is to devise model clauses to be added on to standard commercial contracts, model clauses that allow a response to climate change. And this is being done in working groups of experts, but they do it without attribution. No one gets credit, which means that you can be working in a firm where a client may be an oil company, but in your own time, you could be contributing to a legal response to climate change. And that, I thought, is an interesting model for a profession. In our case, it wouldn't be legal clauses. It would be something like policy briefs, which could be used by decision makers in government, in business, wherever, that would inform. Now, such an exercise would take effort and time and commitment and leadership and all the rest. And it would be perhaps be an alternative to what professional society might do. But one way or another, I do think there's a need to kind of move this forward to achieve practical outcomes that will influence the people we want to influence to get better outcomes. And with that, let me conclude and thank you again.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, David. And that's certainly something we'll reflect on. I mean, certainly I found some of the briefings that the CREDS work that Gillian's been involved in been very useful, and taking that from a practitioner's point of view and weaponising it for use on the ground is actually perhaps quite particularly interesting proposition. So I'll take that back to the society and see what we could do. And as I say, maybe we can, through some of the questions we haven't had time to, David, we could come up with a bit of a blog where we sort of go back and forth on a couple more of these other points as well. Okay, thank you so much that we kept it going, and I think we could have literally could have gone for another hour. Particularly thank you for everybody who's given their time here this evening, not just the panelists but actually participants who've stayed the course as well. This does go up on our YouTube channel, so it will be up at some point and we'll circulate it around our membership. Yeah, so I'll just say good night from TPS and from everybody on the panel, and please do, if you can, come join us at the ICE on the 14th of November, and please do participate in all our webinars moving forward. But thank you everybody for your time this evening, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, David. Bye.
Did you want to continue with anything, Mark, or should we park it?
I